My SoTL work really does reflect the disciplinary practices in the sense of being all about reading texts and all about contextualizing texts. In my disciplinary research, the texts I read are literary texts and popular culture texts, and the contexts in which I read them are historical periods and social trends and social patterns and structures. In my SoTL work, the texts I read are almost entirely the work that my students produce. Sometimes they're the traces of, and that can take multiple forms, the traces of the process through which my students produce things, because I'm often as interested in process as I am in product. So that might mean students' reflections or journals on what they did. Sometimes it's video or audio recordings. Sometimes it's a series of pieces that students developed. So one of the projects I've done looks at how to better facilitate students doing research in literary and cultural studies. And I study that by looking at the series of pieces that students write over the course of doing a project and at their journals about doing that. So those are the texts. And the context is multiple. It's my particular classroom, and what is it that I think this course is about. It's my discipline, and what do I think students need to learn in this discipline, and what does it look like when that happens. And it's my institution, and who are these students, and where are they coming from, including things like where is this particular group of students or this individual student in their movement through a major or a program. It's a different thing, for example, to look at somebody who's a senior English major than somebody who's a sophomore in a general education literature course. And I think I have to pay attention to those things. So all of that provides the context, as well as I think some sense of where are my students coming from intellectually. What do they know before they walk into my classroom? What do I think they know? What are they doing outside of it? What's the rest of their lives look like? So context is pretty complex, but frankly, that's true in my disciplinary research as well. Context is never simple. I think it's Paul Lauder who has this great phrase about always contextualize. I take that as seriously in my SoTL work as I do in my disciplinary research.
We include a great deal of reflection, student reflection. After all, I am teaching actors. That's what actors do, is they reflect on their performance and on the process of where they're going. So we try to include that as part of the piece of inquiry when we're asking a particular question about either the student's process or their state of understanding or knowing at a given point in their development. So that, I would say, is a piece that doesn't often get included or not included in the same way. In other words, long reflective pieces that are then analyzed for thematic ideas, such as in the methodology called grounded theory, is more often the case in my SoTL projects than just survey answers. So I want to make that distinction. We're also dealing with not just cognitive knowledge, but affective and kinetic knowledge, and the integration of all three in an actor's development. This idea of having knowledge embodied knowledge that comes out of the body, is not something that is, except maybe in dance, possibly music, is seemingly integral to other disciplines as it is to ours. So that poses a particularly interesting issue or problem, if you want to call it that. The integration piece is also important because an actor not only has to be able to operate their body and their voice to be expressive of character and idea, but they must also have an affective and emotional connection between all of those and a cognitive idea of how they are communicating to an audience. What are the ideas? What are the issues? What is the character's arc of action and so forth? All of that is cognitive and analytical skills that go along with then embodying them within a voice and body performance. So a little different than other disciplines in that way.
A key humanities move is that we spend a lot of time really thinking about the student as the whole person, the student as not just a literary scholar. And I do think about that as you know, you're being a kind of apprentice in this course for literary scholarship, and so part of my task is to think about that. But you're not just that, you're a whole person, and I'm thinking about an experience for that whole person. Then to carry it forward, my humanities background in epistemology affects, I think, also the specific kinds of questions that I ask. I am interested in specific teaching strategies, ways of structuring a class that'll improve learning, all those things. But I find that I'm more interested in just what's going on. Even before I get to, does this change learning? Does this affect them in some way? I want to know what their experience is, what their experience of confusion looks like, what's going on, what their experience of epiphany, what their experience of boredom, joy, all of that. I'm most interested in what that looks like on the outside, but also from their eyes, from their experience, from their perspective.
Arts and humanities SoTL is hard to define, but when I think about my own processes, I think about the types of questions I'm interested in asking, and they tend not to be tremendously neat or tidy questions. So for instance, I'm very interested in how students read texts and also why students read. And so when I'm thinking about doing a SoTL project, I'm usually thinking about some of my assumptions about reading, for example, and also some of my students' assumptions about reading. And then I spend a lot of time trying to make those assumptions visible. I think a lot of times with arts and humanities SoTL, you'll find that you start with one particular question or idea, and once you've gathered your information and started looking through and interpreting the work, you discover that really what is interesting and surprising was not what you thought going into it at all.
Asking for stories and narrative, I think, is something that's another key humanities move, all the way up through, and that affects everything moving forward, the kinds of evidence and material I want to gather from and about them, how I analyze that. I try to remember to take their utterances, their expressions, their activities as seriously as I take the works of Herman Melville and the novels of Toni Morrison and such. And then even forward, probably the most challenging part at this point in SoTL history is then how I present that knowledge to colleagues. We're still struggling with that, I think. Trying to find genres, styles, ways of communicating what we're learning about student learning and desire and identity and experience, ways of presenting that in the most effective and authentic to the work that I've done ways, in journals, at conferences, in blogs, in video conversations.
One of the things that I wish all scholars in the area of teaching and learning would come to realize when it comes to work being done in the arts and humanities related to SoTL is that every discipline has kind of an understanding of what is evidence, and there are real challenges when we put our own disciplinary definitions of evidence into our reading of what all research should be doing. So when interdisciplinary research in general comes into this challenge quite often, when people have kind of conflicting epistemologies or conflicting ways of kind of knowing and being and coming to kind of represent that knowing and being, and it's no different in scholarship of teaching and learning. So if the idea of all work must be empirical, well, empirical in what context, to whom, and for what purpose? The idea that evidence, as it's come to be known in English and history, can actually be incredibly powerful, even though it may not be empirical in a standard way that an educational psychologist would define empirical.
Arts and humanities SoTL is hard to define, but when I think about my own processes, I think about the types of questions I'm interested in asking, and they tend not to be tremendously neat or tidy questions. So for instance, I'm very interested in how students read texts and also why students read. And so when I'm thinking about doing a SoTL project, I'm usually thinking about some of my assumptions about reading, for example, and also some of my students' assumptions about reading. And then I spend a lot of time trying to make those assumptions visible. I think a lot of times with arts and humanities SoTL, you'll find that you start with one particular question or idea, and once you've gathered your information and started looking through and interpreting the work, you discover that really what is interesting and surprising was not what you thought going into it at all.